Let's discover the wild and boozy secrets of Seattle's Prohibition past. You'll never see the Emerald City the same way again. Welcome to RV Out West. I'm Brooks. Based in the Pacific Northwest, my family of four hits the road to explore the best of RV life out west. From hidden gems and epic destinations to helpful tips and real road stories. So grab your coffee and join the journey. RV travel gives us the freedom to uncover the hidden corners of American history, one backroad, forgotten town, or unexpected story at a time. And few places offer a wilder ride through the past than Seattle during Prohibition. Seattle isn't usually the first place that comes to mind when you think of Prohibition, likely because its rainy, remote Northwest setting hides just how wild this booze soaked city really was during that era. While today's skyline is filled with tech giants and artesian coffee shops, the city once thrived with secret speakeasies, underground tunnels, and bold bootleggers who turned the rainy streets into a haven for illegal liquor. As you roll past on Interstate 5 in your rig, diving into this lesser known chapter of Seattle's past adds a fascinating twist to your journey, where every gas station or waterfront dock might have a story soaked in gin and rebellion. Brad Holden is a celebrated Seattle author and historian, renowned for spotlighting the illicit side of Seattle's past in engaging local history books like Seattle Prohibition and Lost Roadhouses of Seattle. As a self taught urban archaeologist, he curates treasures from flea markets and estate sales, sharing vintage Seattle artifacts online and writing for HistoryLink.org and Seattle Magazine. Based in Edmonds, Washington, Holden continues to uncover hidden stories from the city's bootlegging and prohibition era, making him a go to Pacific Northwest history author. Brad, thank you so much for coming on RV Out West.
Yeah, thank you for having me on.
Yeah, why don't you tell me first just a bit about yourself and what it is about Pacific Northwest history that's such a passion for you?
Yeah, so I'm a local author and historian, and then as I say in my byline on my social media, I'm a finder of old things. So that's kind of how I got into local history. So like since I was a kid, my dad was an automobile collector. He liked to collect and restore old cars. So I'd go to swap meets with him and flea markets and stuff like that. And so since I was a kid, I was always kind of into going to these kind of places and collecting. When I was a kid, of course, it was toys and comic books and stuff like that. And as I got older, my taste, of course, changed. And it for me, it became more local history oriented. I love going out and finding little odd bits of local history wherever I can find it at estate sales, flea markets, wherever the road may take me. And, over doing it for so many years, that's kinda where I learned a lot of my knowledge about local history is just finding this stuff and then bringing it home and researching it. And kind of just through the years of doing that, that's how I've kinda gained my knowledge about local history. So that's probably where the passion mostly comes from, is just this all these decades of collecting.
And are you, born and raised here in the Pacific Northwest?
I was, yep, I'm a true, Pacific Northwest, person, yep.
And a legit Seattleite or Pacific
Legit
Northwest?
Seattleite, I was born here.
Nice. Okay,
Yep.
cool.
One of
That's
the
great.
one of the rare few native, Seattleites.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, I would like to talk about prohibition in Seattle. The very first time that I recently even learned how prohibition affected Seattle was when Mohi first opened, and they had an exhibit in Mohi about prohibition. And for some reason, I don't know why, my mind was blown. I just didn't think that Seattle and the timeline of prohibition. But then, you do the Seattle Underground tour and learn about kind of that body history, and it kind of all makes sense. Let's paint a quick picture of kind of what Seattle was like during Prohibition and maybe who were some of the key players in it.
Yeah, so Seattle during Prohibition, so there were actually a couple different eras of Seattle Prohibition that are kinda noteworthy. So the first era, I would say, Well, there's actually 3 eras, but the first era, so Washington State went dry in 1916. This was 4 years before the rest of the country. We just had a very active temperance movement here because of how kinda crazy Seattle had become, and so they put an initiative on the ballot, Washington State Initiative 3, and then our entire state voted to go dry, and so in 1916, alcohol could not be sold or manufactured anywhere within the state. A lot of people don't realize when it comes to prohibition that there was an entire era of prohibition before national prohibition in the 1920s. You ask the average person, when did prohibition start? And the typical answer you'll get is, in 1920, the Roaring Twenties. And that's not wrong, but there was an entire era of prohibition before that when all these states started voting to go dry. And as each state voted to go dry, the same things would happen within each of those states as what happened nationally with national prohibition. Suddenly booze is outlawed. And so a black market would emerge to satisfy that demand with bootleggers and moonshiners and corrupt cops and speakeasies and all the good stuff. And that's what happened here in Washington State and in Seattle. When we went dry, it kicked off the first era of bootlegging. So there's a first wave of bootleggers before the bootleggers we saw in national prohibition. And the main gang here were the Billingsley brothers. They were an outlaw gang of brothers from Oklahoma, and they pretty much ran the city's illegal booze racket here from I would say 1916 to about 1918, 1919. And then in 1920, of course, national prohibition kicks in. So that kicks off a whole new era here. The main bootlegger to emerge was an ex-Seattle police officer by the name of Roy Olmsted. He was a Seattle cop. He had been on the force since 1907, and a few months after national prohibition started, he gets popped and he's caught just a little north of Edmonds, where I live, unloading a shipment of booze from a boat that had come in from Canada. He gets fired from the force and he decides to become a bootlegger full time. He was, his nickname was the king of the Puget Sound bootleggers because he was the big fish out here, and within a couple years, his operation was huge. He was just smuggling in huge amounts of booze. The way it would work is alcohol was legal up in Canada. What would happen is bootleggers, those who smuggled booze on land, would hire rum runners who were kind of contractors for hire to take their ships up to Canada, usually Victoria or Vancouver. They would load up their ships with as much booze as they could possibly fit, and then they would smuggle it back down here. Uh, there was a bunch of different drop off points along the intracoastal area of Washington. Everything from Bellingham down to Everett, Edmonds, Seattle, Tacoma, all the way down to Olympia. And then once it reached land, once the booze was landed, then the bootleggers would take it over, bring it in, usually a temporary hiding spot, like a barn or somewhere on a farm or maybe in a garage, and then they'd begin taking orders for it. And that's how Roy Olmsted operated. Within a couple years, by 1922, his bootlegging operation was so big that he was Puget Sound's largest employer. That's how many people were on his payroll. It was just a huge operation.
That is awesome, by the way.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I would arguably say that he probably was running one of the biggest bootlegging operations in the country. And you don't always hear that, like, when you were saying about how you went to Mohi and, your mind was kind of blown because you didn't realize a lot of people don't, because usually in the popular media, when the subject of prohibition comes up, it's usually
East Coast.
Chicago, yeah,
Yeah.
East Coast, New Jersey, New York,
Yep.
places like that. You never hear about what was happening over here.
Did we have moonshiners distilling in the woods or doing kinda like they do in Appalachia here in the Pacific Northwest?
We did. After Olmsted eventually gets popped by the feds, goes to prison. And by that time, the feds and the Coast Guard had kind of put the clap down on all the rum running and bootlegging. It was still happening, but on much smaller levels than before. And that kind of ushered in the next level of, or the next era of prohibition. And from, I would say, 1925, 1926 to when Prohibition was repealed, and there was a lot more moonshining then. And Aberdeen was actually one of the major national hotspots for moonshining because of all the hills. There was as much moonshining there as there was in Appalachia.
That is amazing.
Yeah.
Let me ask you this then. Are there any physical remnants of the Prohibition era still visible in Seattle today?
Yeah, there's different landmarks. So, as far as Roy Olmsted, he got arrested a few times, and one of the places he got arrested just before he went to prison was down in Des Moines,
Uh-huh.
Washington,
Yep.
on Woodmont Beach, and in fact, they have a plaque there to kinda commemorate it. So if you were to go down to the main beach down there, you'll see the plaque, the Roy Olmsted plaque. So
Okay.
that's a sight to see. When his bootlegging operation became so big, for a few years was living kind of a Great Gatsby lifestyle,
Yeah.
drive flashy clothes,
Yeah.
fancy cars, and him and his wife bought a mansion in the Mount Baker neighborhood,
Okay.
and that's still there. You can still go visit his mansion that he once lived in. A lot of different people have owned it over the years, including, ex-Seattle Mayor Jenny Durkin. She was the mayor, I don't know, what, about 10 years ago at this point?
Yep.
So she owned the house at one point, but anyway, it's still there. The house is still there. It still looks amazing, and you could see that.
What made Seattle unique compared to other American cities during Prohibition?
Well, one of the most unique things about our area during Prohibition is so in all the other big cities, especially over on the East Coast, there's a lot of violence and stuff, a lot of gun battles and bombings and people ending up dead and turf battles and all this kind of stuff. We didn't have that over here. We were an anomaly compared to the rest of the country. Roy Olmsted, his nickname was the gentleman bootlegger. He didn't believe in violence. He didn't let his men carry guns. To his way of thinking, it was just better to pay people off. And that kind of gentleman bootlegger ethos was applicable for this entire area. The bootleggers weren't having turf battles like in other parts of the country. In fact, they even had a bootleggers convention in 1922 at a downtown Seattle hotel where they went and actually used Robert's Rules of Order. It's this democratic process for groups to decide things. They used Robert's Rules of Order to decide certain rules like liquor prices and who's going to run which territory and things like that. So yeah, things were a lot different here. The bootleggers here were very, very civil, especially compared to the rest of the country. So that's probably the biggest thing that sets the Seattle area apart from how things were operating in the rest of the nation.
That's pretty interesting, actually. What lasting impact, if any, did Prohibition have on the city and let's just call it the surrounding area today?
The biggest impact, I mentioned that Seattle was pretty out of control in the years leading up to when Washington State went dry in 1916. There were a lot of saloons, brothels, gambling parlors, all kinds of stuff, like really, really crazy amounts of it. And so what happened after was repealed in 1933 is the Washington State Liquor Control Board was immediately formed. And their whole goal when they were formed is to prevent that from happening again, that level of vice from happening again. So they instituted all kinds of very draconian liquor laws to prevent that from happening. And that was probably the biggest lasting legacy that in some respects is still we still see today. But some of the rules they came up with, you couldn't bars and taverns and stuff couldn't sell hard liquor. They could only sell beer or wine, and it had to be very low ABV, like basically watered down light beer is what they could serve. You could only buy hard alcohol at a state liquor store, and that was in effect until, gosh, I think like the early 2000s. Also, women couldn't order drinks for themselves. They didn't even want women alone by themselves in the bar. It was, very strongly encouraged that they have a male companion with them, and they had to be
Interesting.
seated. The male companion would go up and order the drinks, but they couldn't be walking around. That was to prevent, prostitution and stuff, but obviously they went too far. It wasn't until 1969 here in the state of Washington that women could actually go up and order a
That's
drink for themselves,
crazy.
which is pretty crazy. And so, yeah, those were known as blue laws, all these different crazy alcohol rules and stuff. And they're still kind of playing out today.
How do you think the story of Seattle during Prohibition helps us understand the city's identity now?
It did for a long time, but that's changed. So Seattle was always kind of like a blue collar town with a lot of grit under its fingernails. And it was that way up until I would say the 90s, until tech started moving in. Once tech started moving in, and you had a bunch of people moving in from other parts of the country to take these tech jobs and stuff, and prices started going up, that changed the cultural makeup of the city. So all the rules and kind of social norms and stuff that were in effect prior to that, a lot of them went out the window. So you don't see the influence that prohibition had, but you did up through the 90s. You just saw um a lot of these old like roadhouses that had changed over the years and stuff that were still going, and some of them were live music venues and stuff, but you don't see it so much anymore. And sadly, a lot of these places are being torn down, so you're seeing less and less of it.
Speaking of badass moves, our sponsor, CamperAlerts.com, is the hookup you need when campgrounds are sold out. They'll help you score that impossible to get site like a total legend. It's summertime and the great outdoors are calling. But did you forget to book a campsite 9 months ago? Well, don't worry. Say goodbye to sold out campgrounds with Camper Alerts. With Camper Alerts, you can choose your campground, select your site type, and set a personalized alert. And when a site becomes available, they will notify you. It's that simple. Visit CamperAlerts.com today and start setting your alerts. Let's talk a bit about some of these last roadhouses of Seattle. In one of your books, you talked extensively about kind of the outskirts of the roadhouses and kind of their impact and how they played a role. So, what exactly were Seattle's roadhouses, and why did they play such a significant role in the city's culture during their heyday?
Yeah, so the roadhouses, so what happened is when prohibition first went into effect, Seattle still had a lot of vice going on. There were still a lot of illegal drinking establishments. There were a lot of speakeasies, and things like that because of basically because of the police payoff system. If you grease the right palms, you're allowed to get by with it. In the mid 20s, there was a regime change, new sheriff, new mayor, new city council, and stuff. And the pendulum kept swinging back and forth. And when that happened in the mid 20s, they were like, "No, we can't allow this anymore. This is out of control. It's illegal." So they put the kibosh on it. So the King County Sheriff's Department and the Seattle Police Department kind of combined together and started chasing these places out of town. And when this happened was early car culture, when they were starting to build a lot of the early highways in and out of the city. There was two highways north of the city that basically went up to Everett. One of them was the old Bothell Highway, what is now Bothell Way or Lake City Way, depending where you're at. And then Highway 99 slash Aurora. And then south of the city was the Pacific Highway, basically connecting Seattle and Tacoma. And so, anyway, when they started chasing out all these speakeasy owners, they just moved north and south of the city, out of the jurisdiction of King County and out of the jurisdiction of the Seattle Police Department. And they just started setting up on these highways. A lot of businesses were opening on these highways since they were so new, kind of taking advantage of early car travelers, gas stations and restaurants and stuff. So suddenly these inns and these cafes started opening up. And probably I would say by 1926, 1927, there was an entire circuit of these places, mostly north of the city, but some of them south of the city as well. And they were basically just like illegal nightclubs. They were speakeasies, for lack of a better word. and there was all kinds of varieties of them. They all looked a little bit different. There was no two roadhouses that were exactly the same. Some of them had very fancy architecture and were these really fancy kind of places, and others were, it looked like a cabin in the woods or something. They're really rustic and kind of crude. But the colloquial term that they began using to describe these places were roadhouses. But that's what they were. They were basically operating as speakeasies, and you could go there and drink as much alcohol as you wanted. A lot of them offered gambling. There's a lot of prostitution at these places. So they gained a pretty unsavory reputation in a pretty fast order of time. And they too started being raided by the Snohomish County Sheriff's Department, usually the ones north of the city. A lot of them managed to stay in business. So they became an important part of kind of like the local prohibition history because we just had this crazy, basically, the vice moved from Seattle and it spread out north and south of the city. So, and you saw that in these places. Some of them are still around. They're, of course, not roadhouses like they used to be, but a lot of them are operating as taverns and pubs and things like that today.
Well, let me ask you then, because one of my questions was, are there any roadhouses still around today? So if so, where are they?
Yeah. So I live in Edmonds, and that's mostly where my focus has been as far as researching these roadhouses. So on Highway 99, where I live, for instance, there's a place called Woody's Bar on Highway 99, just south of the Edmonds city limits in what is now Shoreline. It used to be called Melby's Tavern. It opened up right when Prohibition was repealed, but it was a roadhouse. There was also a place called Albright's Cafe here in the Edmonds area, and it's now Harvey's Tavern. I don't know if you're familiar with the Edmonds area, but if you're traveling on Highway 99, there's a big sign
Yes.
that has a rabbit.
Yeah.
Its ears used to go back and forth. That used to be a roadhouse. And then there's a few also over on the Bothell Highway. There's the Shanty Tavern was a one-time roadhouse, and that's still in operation. The Fiddler's Inn, and there's a couple other places too. So they're still around. As soon as Prohibition was repealed in 1933, a bunch of taverns opened up, and a lot of those are still around, even though they're not necessarily directly tied into Prohibition. There's still a lot of the old bars, and the Buckaroo was one of those that opened up in the early years, probably in the early 1930s sometimes. But yeah, I lived in Fremont in the 90s, so that was my go-to
Yeah.
place was the
Yeah.
Buckaroo. I was
I
bummed
was
when that
in
place closed.
Fremont in the late 90s as well. So, yeah, great neighborhood.
Awesome neighborhood.
I'm assuming then that the reason these roadhouses all disappeared were basically factors due to the legality prohibition ended. And so the economic didn't make sense because I could now open up a tavern. But were there any other legal, cultural, or other reasons that led to these roadhouses decline?
Yeah, so one of the interesting things, I mentioned the formation of the Liquor Control Board and the fact that taverns and bars and restaurants could not serve any hard alcohol. So what happened with these roadhouses and also a lot of early taverns and stuff is they became what was known as bottle clubs. And so basically it was just kind of a clever way to sidestep the liquor control board rules. And so what they did is they basically allowed people to bring in their own bottle of booze. They weren't supposed to do that, but they pretended to look the other way, but they knew exactly what was going on. And so a lot of these bottle clubs that you'd go to, you pay a cover charge because a lot of them had music and dancing and stuff. So you'd pay a cover charge, you'd go in, and then with the cover charge, they'd give you what was called a setup. And a setup was they'd bring you to your table and they'd give you a bowl of ice, a pitcher, a couple glasses, and whatever mixer you wanted. You know, any kind of fruit juice, ginger ale, soda, sparkling water, whatever. And then you would just mix your own drinks. You'd bring in your own bottle of booze and then mix your own drinks. And that way, if the liquor control board raided the place and found booze, the owners could be like, "Oh, we're not serving any booze. We didn't know that people were bringing it in," and they'd just play dumb. And that way, they couldn't be legally charged with serving alcohol. So that's what happened starting in the 30s and into the 40s, and with a lot of these places, they became bottle clubs. The law changed in '48, where they could finally start serving hard alcohol, and that's when a lot of them went out of business. Kind of like what you're saying, they didn't no longer needed to be around. Also, going into the '50s, musical taste changed. A lot of the roadhouses and bottle clubs um, in the 20s and 30s and going to the 40s, they had a lot of big band music and jazz and stuff like that. But the music taste had changed going into the 50s. That's when rock and roll started coming out. So a lot of these places just lost their relevance. They were kind of viewed as, old fuddy-duddy places, the places where your parents or your grandparents would go to. But the younger generation didn't have any interest in these places. So a lot of them went out of business as a result of that, late 40s, early 50s.
Let me ask you this. If a person is coming to the city or to the greater Seattle area, and they're looking for signs of these bygone eras. I know we had talked about some of these roadhouses and where they exist both on Highway 99 and over on the Bothell Everett Highway. But what would you recommend that are some places that they could go to enrich their trip and get a little bit of this piece of Seattle's history? Whether it's Prohibition, like we talked about, or some of these roadhouses. Are there other places and things that they could go and see to kind of take in a bit of this piece of history?
Yeah, I mean, if you want to go way back into like early Seattle kind of vice culture, including Prohibition, Pioneer Square is a great place. A lot of the city's earliest drinking establishments are there. You got the Merchants Cafe and places like that that are all within pretty close proximity to each other. You also have the Smith Tower, which did play a role in Prohibition. It's an historic building down there. It used to be the 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 tallest building, west of the Mississippi for quite a number of decades. Roy Olmsted operated, his lawyer had an office there, and they also he operated his own radio station out of his house, and he set up an antenna in the Smith Tower. So it has this connection to Roy Olmsted and Prohibition, and they've appreciated that. So when you go visit the Smith Tower, there's a lot of wall hangings and posters and little information bulletins and stuff talking about local prohibition history and who some of the important players were. Roy Olmsted and Doc Hamilton, the area's top speakeasy owner, and people like that. And so they really play that up, and it's kind of a fun place to visit. So, and that's also right down there in the Pioneer Square area. So, yeah, if anyone's come in from out of town, they want to kind of get a taste of that part of Seattle's history, that's where I'd encourage them to go.
One rapid fire question for you. In today's day and age, what is your favorite bar in Seattle?
Mm. Well, for me personally, I like Daryl's Tavern, another old school bar. It's been around since the '50s, and that's up in my neck of the woods on Highway 99. It's a great place, awesome music venue. I always try to make that. So that's my favorite place personally is Daryl's Tavern.
Okay. Daryl's Tavern. Love it. Thank you. And then if people want to learn more about Prohibition, the last roadhouses in the Seattle area, where can they go and learn more about the books you've written and where can they find them? And tell me all about that.
Yeah, so my books are available at all local bookstores in Seattle as well as online, all the online book retailers. My first book is probably my most popular one, Seattle Prohibition Bootleggers, Rum Runners, and Graft in the Queen City. That one's still is kind of like the top seller. And then the last book I wrote was The Roadhouses of Seattle. I co-wrote it with Peter Bleck and my friend Pete, who's a music historian, and he basically covered all the roadhouses on the Bothell Highway close to where he lives, and I covered all the Highway 99 ones. And it was a fun book to co-write with him. Also available online at all local retailers. But that's probably those two books would be your top picks for that part of local history.
If anybody wanted to follow you online, where do they go to learn more about you online?
Yeah, go to my Instagram page, Seattle Artifacts. Also, my own personal author page, bradholden.org. You can also get my books there on my author page, and there's links that'll bring you. Also, I have a Substack page, Brad Holden's Vice Files, where I cover local vice history, all different aspects of local vice history. So, yeah, check them out.
Well, Brad, thank you so much again for coming on RV Out West. I really appreciate it. This has been a wonderful conversation.
Thank you so much for having me on. It's been great talking to you.
Thank you again for listening to RV Out West. If you got value from this episode, do me a favor and make sure to follow the podcast in your podcast app so you never miss an episode. It's free, it helps the show, and it lets you know when there's a fresh new episode, and I very much would appreciate it. I'm going to be taking next week off for the 4th of July celebration. When we return on Monday, July 14th, we are going to be diving into the next short series on scenic drives you really shouldn't miss in the great state of Oregon. In the meantime, have an amazing Independence Day celebration with your family and friends, and I'll see you in 2 weeks. Thanks for listening to RV Out West. Be sure to follow the show so you never miss an episode. And if you enjoyed the show, tell a friend and please leave a rating or a review. It would mean a lot. Special thanks to Scott Home Music for our intro song, We Are One. Follow us on Instagram and Facebook to join in on the conversation. Now, get out there, explore, and go see what's beyond the horizon.